welcome to Zoom as Scientists. This is a series sponsored by the Lake Champlain Sea Grants and UVM Extension's education program known as Watershed Alliance. Lake Champlain Sea Grant develops and shares science-based knowledge to benefit the environment and economies of the Lake Champlain Basin. As for Watershed Alliance program, it is a Lake Champlain Sea Grant education program that aims to create K-12 students, aims to reach K-12 students and their teachers throughout the Lake Champlain Basin. Our goal is to increase awareness and knowledge of watershed issues in youth throughout Vermont and New York. The Zoom as Scientist series was created in response to the current need for more virtual programs. Every Tuesday and Friday from now until the end of June, we'll be hosting a guest scientist to tell us more about their research in the basin. Just a heads up, this webinar is currently being live streamed to our Lake Champlain Sea Grant YouTube channel. This is just another avenue for teachers and students to view these presentations. Additionally, all webinars are being uploaded to our YouTube channel shortly, as well as to our website. And that way you can view and share the presentations at any time if you happen to miss them live. So without further ado, let me introduce our first guest speaker today. So today we'll be hearing from Ben Block, who recently graduated from the University of Vermont with his Master's of Science degree in freshwater biology. He is now starting a job with Tetra Tech, a global environmental consulting firm, as an aquatic ecologist and data analyst. He will work on biomonitoring projects for state, tribes, and the EPA, which is really exciting. Will be housed out of Montpelier, Vermont, so he's staying local. So at this time, I'm going to let Ben share his screen, and he's going to present on what do fish eat in the wintertime.
Hi, everyone. Let me just get this set up quick. Let's see here. Okay, is everyone able to see that?
Yep, we are able to see it. Just make sure that you go into presenter mode. Perfect. Great job, Ben.
Awesome. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. We're going to be talking about what fish eat in the wintertime. And along with this, I'm also going to be discussing how the scientific method works, which I hope some of you are learning in your classes. So to begin, I want to talk about seasonality and what seasons are. Seasons are a period of the year characterized by particular conditions such as weather, light, temperature, and precipitation. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with what seasons are, especially here in Vermont. We have winter, we have our mud season, or what most people call spring. Then there's summer and fall. Otherwise, other people call it autumn. We also know that lakes change with seasons. So one thing that changes with lakes is the air temperature above the lake. And I want to pause here and talk about Celsius versus Fahrenheit. So most of you likely learn temperature changes based in the Fahrenheit unit. So here are some standard differences between Celsius and Fahrenheit. Celsius is what is used across the world, but actually not in the United States. We as scientists use Celsius to measure temperature because we can then compare temperature and discuss temperature data with scientists from around the world and not have to do any of these conversions. So you'll be seeing Celsius, but here are some common values that are compared. But back to seasons in lakes, we also know that with changes in air temperature come changes in water temperature. And so in the spring, you can imagine that lakes are about 4 degrees Celsius throughout the whole lake. But as it warms up into the summer, upper water temperatures near the top of the lake are quite warm. And then at the bottom, that still remains that cold temperature. And sometimes in most lakes, you see something called a thermocline, which I believe was talked about a few webinars back if you do want to learn more about it. But it's essentially a difference in temperature. And as it gets colder again in the fall, you see that the water temperature actually gets colder in the surface, but warmer in the bottom. And then finally in the wintertime, which is what I focused on for my research, we often see ice cover in northern lakes. And this is obviously that the water has frozen and is about 0 degrees Celsius, but the water below the ice is still liquid. And that's where I focus my research. But different changes to lakes with the seasons also includes changes in sunlight and light penetration. So obviously, if you're from Vermont or any northern latitude, you know that there's less light in the wintertime. And with less light, there's less coming into the lakes. We also see differences in nutrient dynamics. So this means nutrients as in molecules that are used for growth for a variety of fish and macroinvertebrates, which are little organisms in lakes. They need nutrients to survive. And finally, changes in food availability from season to season. So fish, like us, need food. And in some seasons, like summer, food is more abundant. And in winter, food is less abundant. What I primarily focus on is how fish respond to water temperature. And so this graph here shows all 4 seasons, winter, spring, summer, and autumn, and changes in water temperature during each of those seasons. So what you can see is that in the winter time, water temperatures are obviously cold, and as it warms up into the summer, water temperatures do the same. And to understand how fish respond to water temperature, you need to know that they're ectotherms. An ectotherm is an animal that is dependent on external sources for body heat, and fish rely on water temperature to determine what their body temperature is. And so that means that fish rely on water temperature to function, and that functionality changes with each season. So how fish behave and move and survive all change based on what season it is. However, not all fishes actually prefer the same water temperature. Freshwater scientists, we know that, or we describe fish in 3 different guilds or 3 different groups. We have the warm water fishes, the cool water fishes, and the cold water fishes. All 3 of these fish species, or all 3 of these fish groups, prefer water temperatures that are based on their name. So warm water fish, they prefer pretty warm water temperatures, while the cold water fish, they prefer things that are much colder. So here's our first polling question that I have for you. I want you to think about what is one group of fish that prefer winter water temperatures in Lake Champlain. Would it be the warm water fish, the cool water fish, hot water fish, or cold water fish?
All right, so as Ben just did that, I just launched a poll. We'll keep it up for just a couple of seconds. Again, if you don't have the ability to answer the poll or it's not popping up on your screen, feel free to answer those questions in the chat box. So Ben, do you want to read through it one more time?
Yeah, so I'd like you to think about what is one group of fish that would prefer winter water temperatures in Lake Champlain. Would it be the warm water fish, the cool water fish, hot water fish, or cold water fish?
All right, and I'm going to end the poll and share the results.
So from what it shows on my screen, it looks like that most of you got the answer correct, which is cold water fish. And the other responses are also good. Cool water fish, while they don't prefer winter temperatures, that's actually the subject of the research that I did. So you'll actually be getting to see more about cool water fish.
All right, and I'm going to stop sharing, and then you should be able to continue, Ben.
Awesome, thanks. So a good question that I had was, do fish eat in the wintertime, and are they part of a food web? So some of you should be familiar with what a food web is, but for those of you that are not, a food web is a system of organisms, each dependent on the next as a source of food. So what you can look at is this diagram here, and you can imagine that algae is the base of the food web, and that's true for most lakes. Algae are then eaten by little zooplankton, otherwise known as like water fleas, or eaten by aquatic insects, and all of those things are then eaten by smaller fish, which are then eaten by larger fish. So each organism in a lake gets its energy and eats something else in a lake. And that's what, when we describe all of that together, we consider it a food web. So my research question for my master's thesis was, do fish eat in the winter, and are they part of the food web? Is there still a food web that occurs in the wintertime? So this gets to the first part of the scientific method, a research question. And mine was, Do cool and warm water fish species eat in the winter? And if so, on what? So I talked just momentarily ago about different thermal groups, the cool, cold, and warm water fishes. So my research focused on one cool water species, the yellow perch, and two warm water species, pumpkinseed and bluegill. From that question, I formed a hypothesis. And there's tons of definitions of what a hypothesis is, and I'm sure you will have learned about them or will learn about them soon. But a hypothesis in general is a testable statement. So making a statement that can be tested using science to determine whether you support or refute that statement. And refuting something means that you have evidence against that statement. So my hypothesis for my research was that yellow perch eat in all seasons, including the wintertime, while sunfish, which are the pumpkinseed and bluegill, eat in the open water seasons, but not in the winter. And the open water seasons, those are the seasons not covered by ice. So what you can think of is I'm essentially giving a statement that says this is when these fish are eating, and I'm going to then use science to determine whether or not this statement is true. So to get into this, we had to do science to determine it, and we collected fish in a variety of places. So this is Keeler Bay in Lake Champlain. For those of you that are not in Vermont, this is just north of Burlington. It's a small bay, and it's maximally about 45 feet deep. So comparatively, if you watched one of the previous webinars, you know that Lake Champlain is quite diverse, but it's also quite deep in some places. So this is a very shallow part of Lake Champlain. And I collected fish both in the open water season, which what we consider here is open water. You could drive a boat on it, and also in the ice covered season. So I walked out onto the lake and collected fish through the ice. For more information on that, I collected fish from September of 2018 through the winter all the way until October of 2019. In the wintertime, I went angling to collect fish. So here you can see an ice fishing pole, and we actually drilled holes through the ice and collected all of our species. While in the open water seasons, we used a variety of nets to collect fish, including fyke nets, which you can see behind here, and most often gill nets, which are this diagram here shows. So what a gill net is a large and long net that's weighted down and sits at the bottom of the lake. And as fish swim into it, they're caught, and then we can pull up the net and collect the fish. So once these fish were caught, we actually went and processed them in the lab. And by processing, I mean, we measured how long they were, how heavy they were, how old they were, whether they were male or female, and we calculated a GSI and condition. And both of those are essentially values that you can describe how many gonads they have. So if you're looking at this image here where my mouse is, you see these white portions here inside the fish, and those are actually its gonads. So this is a male, meaning that these are its testes. And if we had a female, you'd also see that it would have eggs here. And so the GSI value actually is telling you how much gonad weight there is in these fish. So we dissected each fish, we took out its stomach, and we looked at what was in the stomach. And you can see here, these are all digested fish that we collected from larger yellow perch. And for fun here, this is one of my favorite fish that I've ever caught. It had some sort of deformity here, which was fantastic. It looked like a little saddle, and you can kind of imagine that some kind of like bug was riding it or something around in the lake. So my second pause for polling is a question about equipment use. And what is one piece of equipment that fisheries biologists use to catch fish? Would it be dynamite, noodling, a gill net, or a harpoon? And I'll give that a little bit yet. Again, what is one piece of equipment that fisheries biologists use to catch fish? Would it be dynamite, noodling, gill net, or harpoon.
All right, so with that, I'm going to end the poll. And I'm going to share the results.
All right, well, I don't think I fooled anyone. It is a gill net. While these are ways to collect fish, we try to avoid harming fish more than we have to. And some of these are quite inefficient compared to nets. But I'm glad that this question didn't fool anyone. All right, let me continue here. So on to the results of my research. This picture here, before I want to move on to those, this picture here is actually from a day we collected fish. And this is me here, but this is my friend and lab mate, Matt, and this is Rosalie. They're both, Matt is a PhD student in our lab, and Rosalie is a postdoc, so she's already got her PhD. So these are both people that would be able to, that are a little bit farther advanced than my degree, but they have done a lot of research as well. And this here is our boat captain, Steve. He just retired, but he was helping us collect fish from underneath the ice. And for those of you, hopefully you can see in the bottom left here, that's actually an ice auger, which is kind of in the background. That's how we actually drill through the ice and then go fishing for fish. So what did I actually find out about what fish were eating in the wintertime? First thing is that fish eat the least amount of food in fall and winter. So I compared all seasons and found that in the fall and winter, fish are eating the least amount of food. And what we found then was that yellow perch are eating enough food to grow gametes in the winter. And gametes are essentially a technical term for reproduction. So like what makes little fish. And so here you can see, I found two images. These are all fertilized eggs, and you can see the baby fish with its eye and its yolk sac starting to develop here. And this is also an image of maybe a different species with little eyes protruding. So what I found was that yellow perch are eating enough food to grow their reproductive organs throughout the wintertime. But sunfish, they don't eat enough food in the winter to actually produce anything. So we found that both the pumpkin seed and bluegill are not eating enough food even to maintain themselves, which is what we actually expect. Also, we saw that the diet diversity was highest for sunfish in the summer and fall, and yellow perch in the winter and spring. And so what this means is that between the yellow perch, which is a cool water fish, and the sunfish, which are warm water fishes, we see differences in how much they're eating and what they're eating in each season. So up here, I have 3 different species that were most commonly found in both the yellow perch and the sunfishes and in their stomachs. And one are amphipods, and these are quite small. They would maybe be about 1 millimeter to 5 millimeters long. And these are somewhat related to shrimp, and they hang out in vegetated areas near shore. These are isopods. So isopods have a variety of common names, and they're quite small. You can see this on this one on someone's finger. Isopods, I'm from Wisconsin, so we used to call them roly-polies. They're also called pill bugs, but you can find them in the water and on land as well. And the last thing that was found quite often were chironomid pupae. And so like most aquatic insects, they have some sort of form, mostly the larval and pupae form, that live in the water. And then in the spring or early summer, these emerge from the water and actually turn into flies, a type of, not true flies, but a type of winged insect. So we see a big difference between the yellow perch and the sunfishes and what they're eating and how much they're eating based on what season it is. However, now I want to talk a little bit about climate change and how it'll impact Vermont fisheries around the world, but also here in Vermont. We know that air temperatures are expected to increase about 5.5 degrees Celsius, which as a reminder is about 10 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. and air temperatures have been warming twice as fast in the winter than in the summertime, which means that winter conditions are going to be affected by climate change. And so what does this actually mean? Well, warmer winters would be shorter winters. We know that in Vermont, at least, ice cover duration, so how long there's ice on a lake, has been decreasing about a week per decade. So about 100 years ago, you can expect that there were about 70 more days of ice cover. And a projection forward, you can expect that about 25% of lakes globally will be ice-free by 2100. So what does that mean? Well, imagine this picture that I took of Keeler Bay, and imagine that's this year, 2020. So in the middle of winter, you'll have ice cover, it has snow cover, it's pretty thick, you can walk out on it. But by 2100, you might expect that Lake Champlain will look like this, where there's no ice at all, and there's more sun penetration into the lake, and it's ultimately just warmer. So my research, while it was focused on a time period when there was ice cover, and we discuss how ice affects fish, we're also really interested in this because we know that this will eventually occur, unfortunately. And therefore we need to describe how fish respond to winter conditions in the current situation to understand what's going to happen in the future. And so to conclude, we know that we found that cool water species, the yellow perch, and warm water species, the sunfish, eat in the wintertime, but the amount that they eat definitely differs. We know that cool water species use energy gained in the winter to develop gonads to be able to reproduce. And warm water species use energy reserves to just endure winter. We found that the sunfish didn't eat enough food and didn't gain enough energy from that food to even survive the winter, and they had to rely on energy that they got from other seasons like the fall. Climate change will affect fish, especially in the winter time. And what that means is that we would see changes in winter conditions and possible changes in fish survival, reproduction, and the transfer of energy through food webs. So today I discussed with you the ecology of fishes, how they relate in a food web. Here you can see how energy and how food is spread throughout a lake. However, there's also other important factors when it comes to these fishes. So the economics, so buying and selling fish for food, that's a pretty big resource in Vermont. You can also consider recreation. The recreational industry for fishing is pretty big here and also throughout North America. And so the money that's spent to go fishing, to buy boats, to rent hotel rooms, all of that stuff drives a massive economy. And finally, it's a culture. So I'm from Wisconsin and we love our Friday night fish fries. And when those are taken away because we don't have any more fish in our lakes, then that's a major change in our culture. But all of these are interconnected and play a role with each other. And that ultimately means that these fish are not only important for the ecology of Lake Champlain, but have a variety of impacts on our society. And so I want you to take that into account when you consider how conserving resources is important. And my final recommendation is this book here called Fishes of Vermont. So I saw that most of you are in Vermont, and this is a guide with maps and life histories and photos of every fish that's found in Vermont. And so it's a great book for identifying fish species and learning about their life histories and all these cool tidbits and where you can find them. But if you're not in Vermont, while this is also a great resource, there are plenty of resources for states such as Wisconsin or Minnesota, or regions like the Midwest or the Pacific Coast. So you can definitely find, if you're interested, you can definitely find books that will teach you a lot about fish. And so finally, I'd like to acknowledge who helped me with this research. I'm part of the Marsden and Stockwell labs at the Rubenstein lab in Burlington, Vermont. And so all of those folks helped me with my research, but I also wanted to thank who funded me for this research, which is the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission. And I was helped with getting that money by Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont. as well as the Explorers Club. And with that, I'd love to take any questions, and thank you for listening about my research.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ben. So if you can actually stop sharing your screen, perfect. I think the way this is going to work, Ben, is we do have a couple of questions, but I'm actually going to pose something to you first. Would you mind describing a little bit about how you decided that you wanted to go get your master's degree and kind of what your path has been for those that are kind of trying to figure out what to do and what options there are?
Yeah, I can tell you about the medium version of that. That way it's not the long story. I initially actually wanted to be a doctor of medicine, but when I went to school and got my bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Minnesota Duluth, I took one ecology class and just loved the class so much. And from there, I was then in various labs as an undergraduate, which let me explore what my interests were. And I actually stumbled my way into Vermont because I found people that I'd like to work with. And that's kind of how I transitioned into doing my master's degree. I knew I wanted to do a master's degree because it's quite needed, at least to get into higher level scientific positions. But I also wanted to explore some research topics that I didn't get to do as an undergrad.
Awesome. And so I've got a couple more questions for Ben, but don't forget, for those of you that are still with us, please stick around for the end. We got a couple last minute polls as well as a take home activity. But with that, Ben, we've got a question here that's got a couple thumbs up, and it says, how can you tell how old fish are?
Awesome question. So it definitely depends on what species you're working with. But what I used to age all of the fish that I collected was collecting something from the head of a fish called an otolith. And so an otolith is an ear bone that is, when cracked, it kind of looks like the rings on a tree. So if any of you have been able to see a tree and see how there's the concentric rings, and you're able to count how old it is, an otolith works the same way as when you snap it in half, you're able to count all of the rings, and that tells you how old that fish is. Other fish species, you might not use that. You might use something called a maxilla, which is a bone in the mouth of a fish. There's also other ways of doing it through genetics, but otoliths are the most common. You can also use scales.
Great. All right, somebody else asked a question that I'm gonna try to pronounce, but I believe it was one of the insects that you showed. And so the question was, how big is the chironomid pupae?
The chironomid pupae. Yeah, so chironomid pupae are often about 1 to 3 millimeters, which is smaller than 1 inch, if that helps. So they're quite small. I was actually talking with some other people about how do fish get full from eating such small invertebrates, and it's, truth be told, it's not one invertebrate that they're eating, but hundreds. So imagine one chironomid pupae being a very small piece of popcorn, and instead of eating one piece of popcorn and saying, wow, I'm full, you're eating a whole big bowl of popcorn.
All right, we've got a question from somebody on our YouTube live. So I'm going to try and look at my screen and read this out loud. So the question is, it says, statement-wise, for shorter, milder winters seem like they would be bad for cold water fish. Do you have a sense of a temperature tipping point for these cold water fish?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because that's kind of what we're grappling with right now in this research. So cold water fish prefer quite cold temperatures, and what we can tell is that the increase that you'd see in the wintertime for maybe the next 100 years would only be about 5 degrees Celsius, which probably wouldn't stress out cold water fish in the wintertime. The worrisome part about those temperature warmings for cold water fish is actually in the summertime, because summer is already a stressful time for cold water fish, because the water temperature is way warmer than they want it already. So they hang out in the bottom of the lake where it's still cold. But as climate change progresses, you will expect that more of the lake will be hotter, and so there'll be less habitat for cold water fish. So it's actually, for cold water fish, not as important about what's happening in the winter as far as winter warming, but rather what's happening in the summertime.
All right, we got quite a few questions that are popping up, which is really exciting. So one of them has more to do, I think, other researchers as well, but I'm sure you ran into it, is what happens to phytoplankton and zooplankton in the winter?
Oh man, that's such a good question. So phytoplankton, for one thing, for those of you unfamiliar, phytoplankton are algae, and they rely on sunlight to photosynthesize and get energy and grow. So in the winter, like I said in the introduction, there is less light in the wintertime for growth. And so we see that some species of algae just go into some sort of hibernation, or we call dormancy, where they don't do anything in the wintertime and they disappear from the food web. Other species are well adapted to that cold water temperature, and some of them are really well adapted to low light conditions. So it depends on the species you're looking at, but for the most part, there is much less phytoplankton in the wintertime than in the summer, but they're still around. The same thing can be said then for zooplankton, which, for those of you that don't know, zooplankton are little crustaceans that are then eating most often phytoplankton. And so the same thing can be said for them. Most zooplankton go into some sort of dormancy where they are not part of the food web, and they're usually in these resting cells at the bottom of the lake. And those then that are still around in the wintertime are at pretty low densities and low abundances in the lake. But there are still species around, and it's actually a pretty active area of research right now as to why some species are around and what that means for the food web in general.
Sounds good. All right, this one's a very specific question due to a specific species of fish. So if you don't know, no worries. But it says, would you be able to study fish ear age, so I believe the otolith, for a halibut? Is that what you would choose to study, a halibut?
Oh man. So unfortunately, I'm from the Midwest and I don't really deal with ocean fish that often. So I can't give you a definitive answer, but it could easily be found out. You could probably Google just halibut aging and you'd probably find great resources on it. I would venture to guess you can use otoliths. I don't see why not. The one part about otoliths that are a bit tricky is that when a fish is very long lived, for example, if a fish lives 50 to 100 years old, you'd see that those concentric rings get closer and closer together, and they're harder to differentiate. They're harder to tell really how old the fish is. So it definitely depends on how old your fish is and whether you can use an otolith.
All right. A question that somebody asked is just, how do you know what type of fish it is? You know, just in general, do you have, I mean, there's thousands of fish out there. So what is one way that you kind of learned what type of fish it is?
Yeah, truth be told, I wasn't a fisheries biologist when I came here to Vermont, and it took me a while to get used to it. But one thing that I thought was really helpful was having that Fisheries of Vermont book. But I also took a few courses in fisheries biology. And you know what, I went out onto the lakes and caught fish for fun and also for my research project, and just got used to seeing what fish are. And honestly, it's really good to find someone that knows what the fish in your area are, and they're willing to teach you. But if you don't have anybody like that, I recommend using the internet. It's a great resource. Buying one of these books, that will help you a lot too.
Great, Ben. It looks like we have two more questions, and I think we have time to answer both. So somebody asked the question, has anyone studied the pressure upon fish populations by recreational fishing, both open water and ice fishing? And then two, if you can just identify, is there any commercial fishing in Lake Champlain at the current time? So two questions, I wrote them into one. I can reread them again if you need me to.
Sure. So the state of Vermont, specifically the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife, would have all of the information for fishing pressure based in the open water and during the ice covered season. They often do creel surveys throughout the year and break up the whole lake into different sections. So I do have the data and it is publicly available. So you just need to contact somebody from Fish and Wildlife. But yes, to answer your question shortly, yes, there is data on that. As far as commercial fishing in Lake Champlain, there has not been commercial fishing in Lake Champlain since the early 1900s. I just believe that there's not enough fish biomass, so there's not enough fish in general in Lake Champlain to support a commercial fishery. And I truthfully don't know the regulations behind it, but I would assume there's some sort of mandate that doesn't allow you to do any commercial fishing here in Vermont. Interestingly, though, the thing that I found quite strange when moving here was that there is a quasi-commercial fishery where if you are a private citizen and you have a fishing license and you go catch fish of certain species here in Vermont, you can actually sell them to various bait shops that also are kind of fishmongers. But that's very low scale and that's not really the same as a commercial fishery.
All right, I think this is a good one to end on because the question is, how do you find fish? And I know as an angler, it's very hard to reveal your fishing spot. So I'm going to tweak the question, and I'm sure they're asking, how do you find the fish, meaning what scientific equipment are you using in order to find the fish that you're researching?
Good to know. So if you have a larger vessel, larger boat, you can usually equip it with a fish finder, which is essentially a sonar device that will determine where fish are as you drive over them in a lake. For me personally, I honestly didn't even use any equipment to find fish. I used the old-fashioned method of trying different spots and seeing what was successful week in and week out. That's kind of the tried and true way of doing it. So if you want to go fishing in Lake Champlain, you will have to put the time in to find fish. But there are technologies available to help you find fish, and that's most often some sort of sonar as a fish finder. There's also tons of resources, both scientific and non-scientific, that describe different habitats that fish like. For example, you'll never find a lake trout that's a cold water fish in 3 feet of water. It just doesn't like warm water temperatures and shallow temperatures or shallow depths. So knowing what fish you're trying to go after will also help you narrow down where the fish is.
Great. Ben, do you think you have time for one more question?
Sure.
All right, so we've got a question here, and feel free to interpret this how you want to. It says, does the amount of food a fish eats differ at different parts of the lake?
Oh man, that's such a good question. Yes. So based on a variety of factors that we could talk for hours about, you can expect that fish eat different amounts of food based on what we call productivity. So how productive a system is. So this goes back to the whole food web idea of if there's more algae, if there's more zooplankton, that means there's more food for small fish. That means there's more food for bigger fish. So when you have more productive parts of a lake, you can expect that there is more food available for a fish, so it has more food to eat. And this kind of permeates throughout a whole food web that as it's more productive, there's more food available. And so lakes themselves are inherently different in their productivity, and that's a whole branch of aquatic ecology research, is the productivity of lakes. For example, if you look back to the Great Lakes, for Lake Superior, it's very oligotrophic. It has very low productivity. But Lake Champlain, it's quite diverse, and there's high productivity areas and low productivity areas. So it definitely depends on where in a lake you're studying, depends on how much food a fish is eating.
All right, so with that, Ben, I think what we'll do then is I'm going to share my screen and we're going to do the last little bit of polling. Nate, once I put up this slide, would you mind launching the poll, please? All right, so if we can just get a little bit of feedback about this whole webinar process, there are 4 questions right here. We'd really appreciate any feedback. So we'll give a couple, maybe 30 seconds for you all to fill out the poll. And then, like I said, we've got a take-home activity in the next slide, so I'll share that with all of you and then give you an idea of what's next in our Zoom a Scientist series. Again, this feedback is very helpful, not only for our scientists that are presenting, but also for this program. We're trying to continue this all the way through June. So the more information we know at the beginning, the more we can iron out everything earlier on. So feedback is very much appreciated. If you want to type in anything extra, feel free to put that into the chat box. So if any feedback pops up that's outside of this feedback poll, feel free to add that to the chat box before you leave the presentation. Maybe we'll give it 15 more seconds. All right, and we're going to end the poll and I'm going to move on to the next slide. All right, so my take-home activity for you all is an activity called Fashion a Fish. This is a Project Wild activity, and it's a great way for you all at home to design your own fish species. So take that how you will, if you want to draw it, paint it, whatever it may be, and talk about special adaptations that allow it to survive in the winter. So think about what is its mouth shape, body shape, coloration, reproduction, food, shelter, and other characteristics. I challenge you to name that fish as well as describe its habitat. So again, in where does it live? We'd love for you to share it with us on our Instagram page. So that's Lake Champlain Sea Grant, or feel free to post it to our Facebook page as well. If you want these instructions after the fact, we'll actually upload it to our website as well. That'll give you specific instructions for this activity.